Welcome to Humanizing AI. In the world of banking, model risk management, or MRM, has been the gold standard for safety for decades. But as generative AI and vendor package models flood the ecosystem, the traditional banking guardrails are hitting a breaking point. It's different. The nature of AI is different now, right? And the question isn't just how we govern these models. My understanding is that for banks, it is also where the governance should live within the bank's DNA. And so to discuss MRM, model risk management, we have Firas Mustapha today with us. Firas is a executive director of data and innovation risk at Arvest Bank, a 28 billion asset bank based in Arkansas. Firas leads a division within Arvest risk management function where he's accountable for AI governance, model risk management, data governance, privacy, third-party risk, and records management. So everything, as you can see, related to risk. So he has a depth of knowledge in risk management. So we're lucky to have him here. He has 15 years of experience in banking and risk management. Welcome to the podcast,
Thanks for
Firas.
having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So what I plan to do, as I was saying earlier, is I really wanted us to focus on what model risk management means for banks and how is it structurally different now. As I understand, you're separating it from AI governance in some senses, right? So when you set up the AI governance at Arvest, you treated it as a function that's structurally distinct from model risk management. What did you see, within this AI governance that you thought it's good to separate these two?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, uh, I'll start by kind of saying that model risk management is really not new to the banking industry. There has been very prescriptive guidance from regulators out since 2011 that had very specific guidelines around how banks were expected to inventory models, validate models, perform ongoing monitoring, etc. And so we've used that as really the basis because we've had to for governing predictive and traditional AI models, in banking. And we are regularly audited and have regular supervisory activities with regulators. And so those programs are mature. They function really well because they have to. There's no real alternative. The introduction of generative AI models and tools in banking sort of required us to sort of step back and consider, well, how would we want to best manage this? Does it go into model risk management or is it a separate and distinct thing? Really, there wasn't a right answer ultimately. There's a lot of difference of opinion in the banking industry, and I can understand why banks decided to, in some cases, give accountability for governing generative AI to model risk management.
Hmm.
Those teams are probably the best suited in terms of understanding the concepts behind how models work, the risks they present to banks, so on and so forth. But for us, there were a few key things that made us believe that separating out generative AI governance from model risk management made sense. Um, and I would say one of the more obvious ones was traditional and predictive AI, which is what model risk management is supposed to govern, just has different characteristics and different risks than generative AI. So a separate and distinct governance framework made more sense to us. When we looked at traditional or predictive AI, in our industry, we typically use that to support forecasts and predictions. We know that it typically uses structured data with more limited inputs and has inflexible, sort of predetermined rules. And a lot of the risks in model risk management, what it aims to sort of mitigate is risks with, bias in those encoded rules and opaque or inconsistent, unreliable decisions. And model risk management performs independent statistical model validation and life cycle monitoring to make sure that AI is governed appropriately. With generative AI, we know that It's about creating new outputs from patterns and behaviors that go beyond a predefined set of rules. And it typically uses large and unstructured data sets. But the risks are different. The risks stem from the training data's origin, unexplainable model outputs, a lack of human in the loop controls, data leakage, etc. So we knew we needed to build governance that focused on things like data, security, model training, human in the loop controls. And those are not the types of things necessarily that you would find throughout model risk management. And so the risks were different, the risk assessments were different, and so the governance frameworks in our minds needed to be different. The other thing that we looked at is we started studying the external environment.
Hmm.
We looked at the EU's AI Act, which really helped us sort of conceptualize how regulators in the US would likely approach the governance requirements. And they read very differently than model risk management. They were far less prescriptive, really focused on use cases, separating, low, moderate, high use cases, even in some cases, prohibited use cases. We also spoke to regulators where we try very hard to have regular contact and open communication with our regulators. And so when we spoke to folks that were deeply involved in writing and maintaining the model risk management guidance,
Hmm.
their communication to us was pretty clear. They expected banks to demonstrate that we understand risks and have a framework for controlling those risks inside our environment. He never said that we had to follow the model risk management guidance.
Yeah,
They never said or pointed us to any other specific guidance. It was more about the principle of governing risks and how you need to tailor that to your organization. So, with all of that said, we thought the best approach would be to separate these two out. Now, they wouldn't live in silos. Model risk management and generative AI governance still have some overlap. And our model risk management team still plays an important part in our generative AI governance program, but they are technically, report to different directors and have different frameworks and roles and responsibilities at our company.
I see. I see. Thank you so much for that. So it was more, if I understand, and I'm trying to summarize for everybody listening to this, it was more on the nature of the AI is different. And because of that, the risks that you're exposed to are different.
Yep.
That's one aspect of it. And second aspect of it is the guidance from the regulators, right? Because you mentioned MRM already has certain guidance. And I saw recently that they actually separated these, right? So they don't have guidance for generative AI. They literally said, okay, the guidance stops here. We need some different frameworks for the newer form of AI. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's exactly right. So that initial sort of large model risk management guidance that's been out there for 15 years or so,
Yeah,
SR 11-7,
right.
that is the guidance that we've built model risk management off of.
Mm-hmm.
And just a couple of weeks ago, funny enough, they issued an update to that. So they rescinded it and put out SR 26-2. So that's the
Right.
new model risk management guidance. It's far less prescriptive than SR 11-7. So it doesn't have this sort of checklist of governance requirements, but rather says, hey, take a principles based approach.
Hmm.
Basically build your model risk management program to coincide with the models you're using and the risks they pose to your organization. And they specifically cut out generative and agentic AI technologies and tools from the scope of model risk management. So they really kind of drew a line in the sand and made it clear for banks these specific guidelines are not required for generative AI and agentic AI technologies. Now, certainly doesn't mean you can't leverage certain principles from there, right? But they just basically drew a line and said,
Right.
you do not have to use these to govern Gen and agentic AI.
Yeah. No, that was very interesting for me because I mean, two things come to my mind coming from more on healthcare AI governance. We didn't have traditional MRM kind of system as I was working in healthcare. So we built one ourselves, and it's almost like a mix of both things that you're talking about right now, because we had to manage classical AI models, our statistical models. And so we had a framework for that. And as we were running that program, LLMs became super popular. People started using products using generative AI, and we had to come up with additional guidance for generative AI risk management. And I think that was different for finance or the banking industry specifically, because you already had something very robust for model risk management or statistical model management. And it's interesting for me to see that diversion, because it's almost like the same thing for insurers and healthcare industry that I'm talking to. Our bank, now they're realizing that they're two separate things, and we'll have AI governance manage generative AI mostly. For healthcare, as I'm talking to these leaders, it's the same within the same umbrella. So it's under AI risk management. So that's why I wanted to pose this question and understand, how's banking thinking about this differently from hospitals and insurers and others in healthcare.
Yeah.
That's super interesting, and thank you so much for that. You briefly mentioned that you tried to follow EU AI Act's guidance a little bit as you were thinking about this. Um, I know now EU is also pushing some of the requirements to 2027 now, but I think that it's more of a framework for you than the requirements from EU, right? So, um, was there something specific in EU AI Act that you liked versus NIST has its own NIST AIRMF, right? So, was there a specific thing about EU AI Act that you liked more than what we have here for NIST?
Yeah. What we found to be the most helpful aspect of studying the EU AI Act is they had a consistent theme, which was you tailor your governance to the risk posed by the use case. So there's not a one size fits all. And so the EU AI Act talked about how you would have lower risk use cases that generally would not require you to do as much governance. Or as much due diligence on the tool and the specific controls around that use case. And as the risks got higher, you would incorporate more due diligence and more governance around that particular use of AI. So it really helped us internally as we developed our first AI policy at the bank.
Mm-hmm.
What did we want that policy to say? What would be our general approach to governing AI? And we took that concept of tailor governance, the level of due diligence to the risk to really be the foundation of what we built.
I
And I can tell you, I think it worked out really well because we got over the months into a place where we were kind of quickly able to understand the inherent risk of an AI use case and
Yeah.
then only do as much governance as we needed to. And that really helped us keep our process more efficient. It helped us spend our time and our energy on the things that really mattered. And so I think that's really the big lesson from the EU AI Act. It wasn't to just follow every requirement in there. It was to take this concept of governance tailored to risk. And with generative AI, it's the specific use case. And so that's really what we found to be the most valuable.
I see. I see. Thank you so much for that. I would want to dig a little deeper onto two things, right? So, one is we talked about risks being different in classical machine learning or NLP or statistical models from generative AI. For the audience, if you could talk a little bit about, how are they different? What are you seeing that's very typical for generative AI or large language models? This podcast is also educational, so just to make sure that everybody's on the same page on types of risks that they should be thinking about. So let's talk about that first, and I have another thread that you talked about that I want to continue after that.
Yeah. So with traditional model risk, so that's traditional and predictive AI, in the banking industry, those types of tools and use cases have been around for probably a couple of decades. I mean, some of them
Yeah.
even preceded the model risk management guidance.
Right.
And there, the risks really focus on the structured data that you're using to train the model,
Mm-hmm.
the way the model has been tuned, and all of the sort of, quote, rules that are part of the model. And then ultimately, are you getting the outputs that you expect from the model?
Okay.
And so, since in the banking industry, we use these types of tools in forecasts, prediction. So, think of things like fraud mitigation or fraud
Right.
detection, loan underwriting. We use it a lot to forecast, things related to asset and liability management. And
Mm-hmm.
so we really take an approach of trying to do a statistical validation. We have people who are much smarter than me, true quants that are doing that type of work. And at the end, we're able to manage the risks by confirming that this model is producing the outputs that we expect. It's
Right.
a level of accuracy that we expect, and we can rely on those outputs. Gen AI models are so different because with Gen AI models, we as users prompt those models, and the outputs that we get are really dependent upon the prompts that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've really focused on human in the loop controls.
Okay.
You, as the human, are you reviewing the output and confirming that this output meets the needs that you have in whatever the scenario is? And so, even in common use cases in our industry, like generating code for software development, it's having that human in the loop that is super, super critical. With predictive and traditional AI models, you typically wouldn't require a human in the loop, right? The
Right.
model gets the output and you can rely on that output. With Gen AI, it's, hey, you get an output that's tailored to what you prompted, but you need to go in and confirm that what you got meets your requirements.
Hmm.
Content creation, content generation is another unique thing to generative AI. And that's,
Mm-hmm.
again, human in the loop really comes in place. Um, One of the other risks that we had to get used to is, with traditional AI, predictive AI, we can get a pretty good sense of how those models are tuned.
Yeah.
And with generative AI, it's far less clear to us how those models are tuned, right? Because a lot of these models are using these frontier LLMs as sort of the backbone. And those are not created for a specific purpose. So it's understanding that the uses for these technologies are very different, and you just again sort of have to tailor the governance to those uses.
Yeah.
The hard part too, I'll tell you, is because model risk management has been around for so long, because traditional and predictive AI has been around for so long, there's a lot less ambiguity around the risks and the controls you need. It's just
Agreed.
really clear. Examiners and auditors will tell you what you need to have in place. With
Exactly.
generative AI being just, really a new technology that's like widely available in our
Yeah.
industry, I have found us in a position where we're talking to the regulators and we're talking to the auditors, telling them, hey, this is what we're observing. So it's a different dynamic than what we're accustomed to. And so even for us, knowing what the risks are and determining what the right controls, it's still a work in progress for us. We're still learning as we're going.
I can totally see that. And I think I agree. I think even when we were running, when I was running AI governance program, I think one of the differentiator was this human component, right? I mean, this human component because with classical AI system and generative AI system, we were asking, I shouldn't say demanding from the teams, we should asking for evaluations on accuracy and fairness and other things, but this human intervention component was unique to generative AI. What I would want to probe a little bit there is it is it the part of AI governance teams that banks for having a guidance for human in the loop evaluations or human in the loop almost like uses and monitoring? And I'll differentiate that, right? So traditionally, you could have a statistical model, and usually the way we do it is here's a machine learning model, here's a training set, here's a testing set. Right on the testing set, here's the evaluation. This seems to run fine. In generative AI, you can take a similar approach, but then because of the nature of the generative AI, we don't, and they're also not good tools to evaluate that automatically, right? So, and then what we did was we were saying, okay, then we need human in the loop for evaluation of the output to make sure that the output we are seeing is accurate, fair, compliant, all of those things, right? So for you, is it more on evaluation of the output, very similar to traditional MRM system, or is it more on, we have this system now, but we need to continuously monitor this, and we need a human in the loop system for monitoring? So which one is a priority for AI governance teams in banks right now?
It would be the latter. It
The
would be
latter.
the latter for us. It would be making sure that we have the right people who are serving as the human in the loop. One of the things that has sort of come up is just because there's a human in the loop in terms of there's a person there to review the output,
Yeah,
that doesn't necessarily mean that's the right person to review the output.
I know, absolutely
Doesn't
not.
mean that person is well suited. In the software code example, so that's a common use
Yeah,
case in industry. Um, you need to make sure that the person who's serving as the human in the loop control is that person skilled and knowledgeable enough to be able to double check the code that was generated by the AI. Is that person prepared to identify the specific maybe issues or vulnerabilities in that code? Is that person, I guess, is management confidence that that person would actually do that check instead of just shifting it into a production
right,
environment?
right.
So some of that goes into, understanding the culture on the team and understanding the expectations that management has and what type of training and knowledge is sort of rooted in that area even before AI was introduced. And so there's almost an aspect of it of are we prepared to serve as human in the loop controls? So those are the types of questions and issues that we've sort of come up against, and I think it's a credit to our particular organization and the risk culture that we've had because, we've talked to different people in the business, and they've said, "Hey, my team." In some cases, I thought they were very transparent and honest, and said, "I have some concerns about people, being that appropriate human in the loop. And so maybe we take a little bit more of an experimental approach here, or we put
Mm,
more of a sandbox environments
yeah,
until we feel really comfortable that our people are prepared to be those reliable
yeah,
controls."
yeah. I mean, it's a separate topic, so I wouldn't dive it deep into it today, and maybe we can talk about it later in another episode, maybe. But human in the loop is tricky, as you can imagine, right? Because, I mean, as I say, there are two aspects of it: one for evaluation, one for continuous monitoring and things like that, right? On evaluation, the same problem is present where if you're evaluating as a human being the output of the AI, are you qualified to do that? And also, how do you follow you know, guidance from research community, like how many people should be involved, how many people should you do that? So there's a lot of things that go into evaluation.
Yeah. So I think for us, there were just a lot of things that we needed to learn, things that we felt were sort of like prerequisites
Yeah,
that we needed to learn before we run out and buy tooling. And so a few things that come to top of mind for me were we needed to understand how to incorporate AI governance into part of our company's broader change management process.
right.
Anytime you introduce something new, the concept of introducing it is a lot easier than the reality of introducing it. and making it fit into what people in the company are accustomed to in terms of change management. So we needed to first figure out where AI governance was going to live, not just the whole, model risk versus a separate
Yeah.
vertical, but really where would it be? If somebody wanted to introduce a new AI tool or technology to the company, how would we make sure that we got to it and governed it at the right phase in the process? So we needed to really figure out how to incorporate governance, AI governance into change management.
Hmm.
I also think we needed to learn how to tailor our governance program, specifically the level of due diligence that we need to perform on different types of AI use cases. So one of the things that I've observed in, months later as we started shopping for a different tool, for a tool to use, is that, a lot of these tools do rely on you as the user to sort of configure them.
Yeah.
How do you want governance to look like? How would you set this up to align with your policy and your framework? So before you can do that, you need to decide what you want your policy and your framework to be. And so we use those months leading up to any sort of consideration of buying a tool to do just that. I think another thing that we wanted to learn is we wanted to learn what our internal customers, our business partners found frustrating or challenging about the process. There are certain things that I think tools are really well positioned to solve for in AI governance, but I don't want to assume anything. We want real world lived experience at our company to kind of drive us understanding what the actual challenges are and how tools could best sort of solve them. And so, we have our own challenges on the governance side.
Hmm.
But we have another party in this process, which is our internal customers, people who sit in the business units that are bringing tools, that are procuring tools, that are implementing these things, and they have their own experience with
Right.
AI governance. And so we really wanted to understand from them what's going well and what are you finding, to be a challenge. And then I think both from the user side and the governance side, we also wanted to better understand like what are the problems that we have on the governance side that we think a tool can solve for. So it didn't take long for us to realize that there was a litany, a patchwork of different state laws that were
Yeah.
emerging and that were passing. And we're like, well, we subscribe to a lot of newsletters, we subscribe to other, corporate obligation style tools that help us track what's happening in different places, different jurisdictions. But it was going to get to a point where we couldn't do that ourselves. So that's an
Hmm.
example of a problem staying on top of a changing state law environment where we thought that's a problem a tool can solve for us, a tool that's built for that.
Right.
Before we started doing any of this, we probably wouldn't have known that was such a challenge for us. And so it really helped us this experience determine like, here's the list of the top 3, 4, 5, 10 problems that we want
Yeah.
a tool to help us solve for that we can't
Yeah.
solve for ourselves. And so when we started the process of acquiring a tool, we were very clear, I thought, about what our requirements were and what we were hoping to accomplish from that.
Yeah.
And Um, I think typically in our industry, you find people running out and buying tools first
I
and
think it's in
deciding
any
like,
industry.
yeah, exactly. Like any industry, you need the tool to be able to do the thing. I understand that temptation. I really do. And maybe
Yeah.
in some cases, having a tool would have helped us, early on.
Yeah.
But in my experience, it's always been more useful, more beneficial to go out and get some real world experience. It's sort of like a sports analogy, right? Quarterback can only run the offense after he gets some reps in
Hmm.
practice. And so I
Yeah.
felt like we needed to get our reps in before we really understood what we wanted from a tool. The other thing that was sort of a bit of an unexpected benefit is because we didn't get bogged down in trying to buy a tool right at the beginning. I
Yeah.
felt like it put us in a position where even though we had, very basic governance process, very basic risk assessment, we were able to keep up with the business and with the company. As
Mm.
people brought tools and technologies and use cases to the bank, we were prepared with a governance process. Again, far from perfect, not as mature as it ultimately needs to be, but we were prepared to help facilitate AI adoption by having a governance framework in place instead of saying, well, we can get to that, but we have to finish procuring our tool and setting it up
Yeah.
and configuring it first.
Yeah.
It wasn't something we planned for, but an unintentional benefit of all this is, we were ready to meet the company in terms of helping to facilitate adoption through governance.
Yeah. 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 No, I love that. And I think many successful leaders have done that. That I've talked to many leaders in past 6 months, I would say, where I was trying to understand the mindset of like why you went with a tool, and it usually comes down to look. I mean, one of your answer, right? So because you wanted to understand the regulations properly and be ahead of them, and you need a tooling solution for that, among other things you said, right? And it's the same that other leaders have told me in finance, in healthcare, and also some other people might say, well, we've been doing this manually and it's just taking us too long and we need a solution to speed up, right? So you first figure out what do you need, like why do you need a tooling solution and what is not scaling up, and and then some people decide, okay, then I'll just go and build it myself. If you're a big company where you can throw, you know 10 engineers at it and want to build it internally so that it's very unique to you, then people go that route. And if you don't want to do that and rely on external knowledge, then you go with the vendor, right? So I think I just wanted to understand you, like for you, typically, like what happened and why you went there, and that's helpful to know.
Yeah.
We're almost approaching towards the end of the podcast here. What I would want to talk about, and let me summarize this, right? So again, for our audience, we talked about how is banking industry different from healthcare and others on how they think about model risk. And then also because in the sense that they were already mature thinking about model risk than many other industries. How is finance and banking now thinking about AI risk that is separate from the statistical model risk, and why Firas thought about separating them a little bit within the company, even though they work together, because the risks are different, and why he thought EUAI Act had a good framework that he could follow on. So I that was the thread we followed, and then we continued to talk about, okay, we did this manually, we tried to do all of this, and then he thought about, okay, I need a tooling solution here, and exactly why he needed a tooling solution, we went with that, right? So love your thought process, Vice, here, right? So one thing we would want to end this podcast with is, you have shared with me personally that the most mid-sized banks are starting to think about AI governance in this sense, the sense that we are talking about right now, right? So, which means that many risk leaders are probably a few months behind of where others are, even you are in some senses, right? So, if a peer, you know, chief risk officer or chief data officer or risk leader at a same size bank reaches out to you tomorrow and says, I'm starting from scratch on AI governance. Where do I begin? What would your advice be for them?
It's a good question. My first piece of advice, and this wouldn't be about what to do, but it's how to think. My first
Mm-hmm.
piece of advice would be just get started. Don't worry about having something that is perfect, that is mature, that is ultimately going to be what you want at the end of the day. The best way to implement this is to just get started. And so I would spend time talking to peers at different banks. One of the things that I love about our industry is that I can call on a number of different colleagues and peers through different, working groups, industry trade groups, and people are always happy to talk shop and to share, ideas with me. So spend a little bit of time just figuring out what other people are doing, the ideas they have, and just get started. I would say something just similar to what we just talked about. Don't worry about buying a tool at first. Figure out how you want to structure governance at your company.
Right.
Do you want a committee model? where you have a group of cross-functional, individuals serving on a committee that approves every single use case? Or do you want maybe a little bit more of a nimble model where you have a smaller group of maybe risk-oriented people that are trying to tailor the risk, the governance to the risk, and to try to help things move along a little bit more smoothly? There's pros and cons to either, right? And I think
Agreed.
you would know your own company's culture better than anybody, right? So what fits your company the best, right? And then I would just go back to, you are not going to be in a place where you're managing generative AI risk the same way that you're managing model risk or any other type of risk at the company, because you've been doing that for much longer. You've had more prescriptive guidance. So the expectation for a lot of risk people at banks is we kind of want that same level of quality, that same, excellence at managing risk. But I'm like, this is a new and emerging technology
Yeah,
and tool. We're all just learning. Let's not let perfection or even good get in the way of progress. So just figure out what others are doing. There's a couple of different kind of models that you could look at, and then just get started. You'll be amazed at how much you learn quickly. And then from there, kind of doing what we did, which is just tailor, to what you've learned, right? You'll figure out what you need tooling for. You'll figure out how you fit your process into the broader company, but you just have to get started.
that's a great advice, and I especially love that advice because when we were building AI governance at Help Group, we had our own DNA, we had our own framework and style, and once you have that, it's also then you think about specific things that you need tooling for, as we talked earlier, and also none of the tool exist that can fit exactly what you want to do. So you
Exactly.
really have to be thoughtful about. It's not about tooling; it's about the risk that's unique to my company and how I help navigate that. It's not about using the most shiny tool or most shiny technique for AI governance or risk management. It's more of how do we, as a company, come together from security perspective, cybersecurity perspective, governance, privacy, right? So how can everybody come together, as you're saying, committee based, right? So love that, feedback and guidance for everybody, Fires. And again, thank you so much for joining us in this episode, trying to help our audience understand how model risk management is different in many senses from the newer AI governance that banks have started thinking about and others should probably think about. And that was the goal of today's episode. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. It's been a good time.